I would like to welcome everyone for this year's first meeting about security and economic issues of Asia. As currently Central Eastern Europe got international attention from all around the world, for the obvious reasons, the multiple issues in Southeast Asia remain, and we could call it as one of the neurologic areas in the world. Therefore, I wanted to invite all those fantastic experts, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation, to give us short introduction and outline what's going on, especially in the context that in the middle, at the beginning of this year, the economists in the context of Taiwan wrote that Philippines might become the second Poland. So first, I would like to welcome Dr. John Ng, who is a research fellow in a think tank, School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. He has a very wide experience, including private sector, but also in African continent, and was also educated in the UK, where he also published his book, Contesting Sovereignty. We have asked also His Excellency, Professor Jerzy Bayer, who is more well known as expert of Northern Asia and also a correspondent in Asian capitals, including Beijing in 1989. However, he has strong connections to Southeast Asia as well, especially as a former ambassador to Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, and also as a military expert. He was a support and logistician in peacekeeping missions, including Cambodia. I would also welcome Dominika Janus, who has also very wide Renaissance interests from technical studies to humanities and social science, who is also a cybersecurity and military technology analyst, currently based in Iceland, but for some years living in Singapore and other countries in Southeast Asia. Also, cordial welcomes to Łukasz Stach from Krakow, from University, Jagiellonian University, who was experienced in Singapore and Malaysia, and also published innumerable book chapters and papers. So when we start first, we need to know what we're standing on in the context of the main transborder and internal security issues, because it's often a starting point. So maybe Łukasz could start.
Okay, at the beginning, I would like to thank you for the invitation for this meeting. I feel deeply privileged that I have the opportunity to take a part in this meeting organized by such recognized institution with such recognized expert. When we are talking about security issues, transborder and internal security issues in Southeast Asia, the situation is dynamic and it has changed recently. And due to the fact that Southeast Asian countries, Southeast Asian states are caught between the great powers rivalry. During the last decades before the COVID-19 pandemic, the Southeast Asia economic growth was very fast. When we are looking at the statistics, for example, the Filipino GDP was growing over 78%, Malaysia 36, Indonesia over 100. So the economic indicators were a very good one, and it was one of the side effects of Chinese growing power, because China became a very important economic trade partner of Southeast Asian countries, and also Southeast Asian states profited from the relatively stable economic situation. However, the situation changed because China, as we perfectly know, challenged the United States in Western Pacific, and the United States also tried to contain China, try to stop the China's expansion in this region. And these countries like Filipino, Malaysia, Indonesia, they are just between Chinese dragon and American eagle, which is in my opinion, the biggest threat for their prosperity and stability, because this region, very important from both economic and strategic reason, is caught between the great powers rivalry. When we are talking about security issues, as I said, I think I should concentrate on the Filipino issues. The Filipino are in very difficult position because they are directly between China and United States. There is a problem of maritime claims in South China Sea, and of course the Filipino is weak state. Despite the economic progress, the relatively well economic indicators, the Filipino military capabilities are very limited. And also Filipino had to find itself between China and United States. And the Filipino policy was trying to adapt to the situation. I think we will talk about it. But as I said, great powers rivalry, South China Sea issue, also Taiwan issue. They are the biggest threat. About the region, in the case of the Filipino, there is also other, let's say, minor problems, but for Filipino they are quite challenging. It's question of what Sabah dispute, Sulu region, which is a kind of gray zone between Malaysia and Filipino. Also, there is internal problems like jihadism in Mindanao region, the problem of neo-Maoist uprising, New People's Army. So the list of the challenges for the Filipino is very long one, and amongst the Filipino politician decision makers, there are not any clear answer how to deal with it. Especially it's the side effect of the weakness of the Filipinos. So to summarize my part, in my opinion, the biggest threat for Southeast Asia region is the great powers rivalry, the clash between China and United States. We observe it on the economic reason. For example, Trump administration imposed some sanctions on China. Nowadays, there is this issue of microchips, but also in the question of military. China de facto militarized the South China region by building artificial islands and expanding its military capabilities. Also, United States strongly supported Taiwan, and nowadays United States returned to the Philippines because probably they will build up its military potential in this region. For the Philippines, is a risk of being a battlefield or being a playground between China and United States. Other Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, also face this dilemma. So the great powers rivalry, South China Sea issue, Taiwan issue. For the Filipinos, there's also problems like uprising, jihadism, maritime piracy also, because the Southeast Asian waters are quite maritime piracy prone. So the list of the challenges is the very long one. However, as I said, during the last more or less 2 decades, thanks to the economic growth, the region improved this situation. When we look on the all indicators like state fragility, economic, human development index, the situation improved. However, the whole environment has changed, and nowadays all these countries has to find itself between China and United States. And this great power rivalry, in my opinion, is the biggest threat for the whole region stability.
Okay, thank you very much. And how the perspective looks from Dominica's side.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, firstly. And maybe I will draw upon what my colleague said before, but also my expertise, which is predominantly law enforcement. And from this perspective, the key issues to consider here would be financial crimes, human trafficking, cybercrime, terrorism, and region's booming trade in synthetic drugs. I really appreciate how Łukasz divided it between countries and went in depth, but I think it's also quite valuable to look at those overarching themes because of the trans-border nature of security issues that Southeast Asia is dealing with. And what I mentioned before, specifically cybercrime, or maybe in the area of cyber, this is really linked to what was mentioned about economic growth and also certain innovations that the years of COVID brought to Southeast Asia, which is very dynamic development in the area of connectivity. And that, in fact, leads us to another huge thing, that is internet falsehoods, deepfakes and disinformation, because these aspects are really affecting politics. They also affect people's choices. And many reports are highlighting the growth of internet use and technology use among people. So in my opinion, this is one of the biggest issues we should be looking at. And again, as mentioned before, they are all interconnected. This is really visible in the financial crime area, because UN bodies and Interpol are really highlighting in their reports how much the influence of organized crime is moved to seemingly legitimate businesses, which is exactly why I consider it being quite an important field. Thank you. Happy to talk a little bit more about it if time allows us.
Of course, and also a short introduction from Joel.
Hi, thank you. Okay, I have a few slides, if I can pull them up. Hold 1 second. Okay, can you see that? All right, thank you very much. I also want to echo my panelists' thanks for inviting me to this talk or debate, as you call it. I had a wonderful time in Poland, not least in thanks to Katarzyna's hospitality, and I appreciate meeting some of the people here again virtually now that I'm back in Singapore, and keen to learn more about all of your respective interests as well. So I work for something called the Center for Multilateralism Studies. So naturally, we tend to take a very big picture, bird's eye view of our security challenges in the region. And but it nicely dovetails actually with what Łukasz and Dominika have already spoken on, particularly the great power rivalry and some of the cyber issues. So I hope it's not too far away. I have 3 particular global challenges that I want to stress or discuss. One is receding multilateralism. So as you know, ever since Brexit, I think not only Brexit, but Brexit was the thing that really brought it to global attention, which was that regional organizations, multilateral formats are under stress and under competition from other states who think that they have other ways to solve the international order problems. And this is not only that some states are leaving, but also that reform, which is the primary way to address these states' dissatisfaction with multilateralism, is very, very difficult. The second one is digital and technological competition. This has emerged especially in the context of the US-China rivalry, but of course has been around for a much longer time. And the third one is a relatively new phenomenon, the weaponization of interdependence. But we've seen this particularly in the context of the Western response to the Russian invasion. And I want to bring about the wider implications of this to talk about Southeast Asia's response. Now, first of all, multilateralism. So the main problem is that global institutions have not kept pace with transformations in the global economy, right? We have had many debates about all of the various multilateral institutions, the UN Security Council, financial institutions, WTO, and most recently the WHO after the pandemic. And each of these need reform. Each of these need to be updated really to the 21st century. Most of them are fundamentally designed around 20th century problems. But this has been very difficult because the growing political tensions are very difficult to address between emerging powers, established powers, and so forth. And this problem, of course, is that they're both now ineffective. That means if you look at the UN Security Council, it can't do anything about the Russian invasion. For example, the WHO was very, very seriously criticized over the pandemic. The WTO is unable to solve the US-China trade war. And at the same time, they're going through legitimacy crises. So they can't address the problem, and they are not even recognized as being the right mechanism to solve the problem. The second one, global challenge I want to talk about is digital competition, a slightly larger picture issue than just cyber crimes, etc. Although this is involved in the stakes. And this is really not necessarily at the state level, although much of it manifests that way, but also at this firm level between firms. And there's a winner takes it all mentality here between the big tech companies, which, if you get into a position like Amazon or Facebook or Google, you really do take everything. If you look at their positions in their respective domains, they really number one, number two, and nobody else in the picture behind them. So unlike international trade that we built multilateral institutions around, there was, under international trade, there was a sort of win-win solution, the theory of comparative advantage. If states specialize, then we can find ways to benefit from trade. In the digital sphere, I think we have not yet come to finding out what the win-win solution is. And so this is very difficult because the current model seems to suggest domination by big technology firms, right? And now increasingly you find that China and the US particularly are going behind their firms to try to bolster them. If we saw the recent discussions on TikTok at the US congressional hearings recently. And I mean, on the one hand, that is unfortunate that it's been so politicized, but if you look at China, they've banned all the big tech, US big tech firms of the last, Google, Facebook, Amazon, all of these things are having can't even get into China in the first place. So the US is hardly the one to start in this particular space, the exclusive competition in the digital sphere. And increasingly, we're seeing some of these policy mechanisms now being formalized, and industrial policies and protectionist agendas are actually being bandied around, but masquerading as security policies, which if you're security policy, you can't be questioned, right? Because it's about national interests. Then thirdly, the weaponization of interdependence, right? Interdependence has been held up as the most critical node for global order and our sort of global security as well, because states have a vested interest not to disrupt the system because they benefit from it. Now, interdependence also brings up some sort of vulnerabilities for individual states, which is that you're interdependent, you're reliant on certain parts of the system, and these critical parts are controlled by other states often. So during the pandemic and in response to the conflict started by Russia, interdependence had been weaponized, particularly by Western states who occupy most of these important critical nodes, right? And they initially start off with very good intentions, right? And pandemic response was about bringing back industries home because, the supply chains were all disrupted. In the case of Russia, you have the need to sanction not just individuals, but much more extensively than that, and so forth, right? But now that these tools are there on the global policy toolkit, there's a very real fear among smaller states that these weaponized interdependence can be used against them for some sort of perceived misdeeds in the international order. Now, so after that, following these global challenges, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was the most pressing immediate concern. And it disrupted the international system very significantly. And I've classified three distinct understandings, I feel, that have come out of in terms of the global understanding of what's the implications of this invasion are. First of all, there's the narrative of the war on democracy, which has held particularly in the West. Second is largely held by large non-aligned powers, which is that there's become a global imbalance of power, right? The West is actually, which had been previously under some sort of divisions, thanks to, in part to the rise of populism internally, has united around anti-Russia coalition, and non-aligned powers that are not part of this coalition are fearing an imbalance of power. And then small states, of course, view the Russian invasion of Ukraine as a threat to international order, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And this can be encapsulated in a threat to a rules-based order. So what has happened? In my view, there are these three different views come up with three different policy responses. I apologize for the lot of text on the screen in front of you. But the states that have seen the war as a threat to democracy have tried to band around common cause between like-minded states, right? So they use a lot of these ideas around friendshoring or reshoring, bringing back their industries home that they first discussed during the COVID crisis, but now also using around the response to the Russian invasion. A second view also comes from the non-aligned states. They can't really do the same level of friendshoring. They don't have as many friends. They don't have common interests to near the same degree, but they still have problems with this Western response. So what they've been trying to do is to use strategic acquisition of resources. There's certain things, semiconductors and the materials for building these things, microchips, as Dominika had mentioned, right, are critical in this global order. And they've been trying to corner these markets. Large states such as China and India do have very big clout to do this. And that's been part of their response. And then, of course, the small states have been trying to double down on multilateralism as the only safe and important response to all of these pressures, global challenges, as well as the war in Ukraine, but have been basically shouting and nobody seems to be listening, if we look at the amount of degree of response or reform of these institutions that they've called for. So what are my fears? One is that the long-term impact really is that all of these policy response in the short term are rational and look after their domestic national interests adequately, but in the long run, weaken the interdependence system and the global order, which, as I've mentioned, has already been under stress for much before all of this, right? So in my view, I fear that long-term insecurity is actually going to increase even as states think that they are addressing their insecurity problems domestically, right? So finally, ASEAN, what does Southeast Asia need to do? Right, we've actually been quite successful in building our regional agenda and regional initiatives, right? We've had recent successes with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. In not ASEAN specific, though, is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership and our ASEAN Community Building Vision as well. Right, so we all have different interests. Everyone has often talked about how ASEAN states are so divided, but different because of different levels of economics, development, regimes, and so on. But we all have the very similar interests in terms of preserving a rules-based order and balancing against the sort of geopolitical tensions that are the sources of our insecurity, right? And the other thing is that ASEAN was very successful in the Cold War in building up its own sort of norms of regional order, such as the Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapons Free Zone, the Bali Concord, and the treaty, and most importantly, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. And we did this in the middle of the Cold War, which was as much a grave challenge to international order then as the current tensions appear to be now. So in short, I think that ASEAN still has a way out, even though the pressures are very strong and challenging. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. I would like to go back to the security issues and how the states address these challenges. You all covered most of it, but I would like to go more into the details. Dominika?
Yeah, maybe I will go back to the cybersecurity part initially, just to draw upon what Joel said about ASEAN. Because I find it quite fascinating how each country has to care about their own cyber hygiene, but it is also important to maintain this regional framework, international trade framework, due to nature of threat. And it is a fact that ASEAN made significant progress on this point, on this front. However, the disparity between countries such as Singapore, for example, and even Indonesia, that is really dependent on online digital resources, it's shocking. It's a really stark contrast. It's quite interesting to see how countries are learning differently on their mistakes. And for example, the situation of OCBC leak quite recently in Singapore, it really shows that Singapore learned from their mistake, and there is not only a lot of campaigns, but also certain bodies established to help deal with such issues, whereas other countries might not really do that. There is cybersecurity capacity building, definitely a very effective tool. Cooperation also together with Interpol, for example, and several UN bodies. They do contribute to improving ASEAN's cyber resilience on so many fields. And obviously there are issues such as participation in UN group of government experts on cybersecurity that took place around 2021. This is where it ended. Again, ASEAN was very active, and you can really see the willpower to do something about it. In terms of other transborder challenges, I would say that it's quite difficult for such diverse countries like countries of Southeast Asia to tackle crime networks that are quite complex and that develop complex supply channels across the region. It is very easy to circumvent. It is very easy to evade authorities, even though law enforcement agencies, including border security agencies, do cooperate within ASEAN framework, but also on a bilateral basis. There are border control frameworks, as I mentioned, but they are relatively weak. And this is not only my opinion. This is something that UN reports were highlighting over and over again. And this is also because of issues such as border conflicts, porous borders, and internal situation in countries such as Myanmar. For example, from what I remember, around half of irregular migrants in Southeast Asia are currently from Myanmar, Cambodia, and Lao PDR. So that I guess that shows something about difficulty of the situation. And just finally, I'll tackle the illicit drug market and wildlife and forest crime. It is quite hard for governments to tackle it, especially the wildlife and forest crimes, because of how difficult this is to detect, due to the fact that, for example, timber production is really embedded in legitimate trade. It is much easier with illicit drug market, obviously. But again, this depends on a country, since transnational crime groups are involved in both manufacturing and trafficking, and there are different levels of cooperation in tackling both of those areas. Finally, the problem that I see is that law enforcement efforts and authorities' efforts are quite often focused on targeting low-level offenders, because that shows results, that shows really nice numbers. But in the end, the networks remains unharmed, and there are numerous recommendations by both on a national level, but also international level. But we can talk about, strengthening policies, legislative and regulatory frameworks. But it takes a little bit more than just discussions about new frameworks to counter those issues. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. This was very insightful introduction. Of course, it's always we feel it might not be sufficient to cover all the nuances. Given that we know the current situation, what are the possible scenarios of this situation development? What are other forthcoming threats and challenges? Maybe we can come back to Łukasz.
What about scenarios? Maybe in a minute, but as Dr. Joel noticed, erosion of international rule-based order is also a big threat, especially that Southeast Asian countries heard in 2010 from the Chinese official that China is a big country and you are a small country, and that's a fact. And I'm not surprised that Southeast Asian countries start to be afraid of growing power China and the growing Chinese assertiveness in the region, because there were strong economic bonds between these countries and China. And suddenly they hear that they are just small countries and China is a big player, and you have to adapt to the situation. And about the adaptation to this situation, the countries choose a different tactics. For example, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar chose a bandwagoning. They just became the Chinese satellites, in fact, especially that China was able, thanks to the very smart using of economic diplomacy tools, were able to, in fact, catch these countries in a debt trap. And these countries became very dependent to the China, especially in economic and financial terms. Other countries try to balance. For example, Vietnam is a hard balancing. But what we may see, for example, these countries try to build a net of alliances. Also, they try to enhance military capabilities, because in the air and sea domain, which is important in South China Sea region, countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, Thailand try to build up military capabilities. They modernize navy and air. Also, Filipinos try to do it. However, in the case of Filipinos, is that it's too small and too late, and the position of the Philippines in the military fields and power projection is in fact very weak. And also, these countries try to find their own strategy, how to solve this domain, how to solve all this problem, because this erosion of international rule-based order, it's a big problem for this, as China said, small countries. For example, Filipino tried many strategies depend on the Filipino administration. For example, during the Benigno Aquino presidency, Filipino de facto challenged China. There was a UNCLOS issue, Permanent Court of Arbitration, about South China Sea, and Filipino were victorious. However, China called the verdict illegal, and the using tool and when the Filipino use tools of arbitration and diplomacy, they failed because China came to the conclusion that it's too powerful and could disdain the verdict. During the Rodrigo Duterte, Filipino tried to lead a policy of, as Renato de Castro, Filipino analytic, said, politics of appeasement towards China. However, this policy also failed, and even Rodrigo Duterte, at the end of its presidency, came to the conclusion that this policy led to nothing. And finally, though, nowadays, Filipino reluctantly became a de facto United States ally when the United States made this agreement with Filipino that America will return military to the Filipino. What about the scenario? It's difficult to predict because, as we said, the situation is very dynamic and there are a huge number of interdependences. For example, the situation in Ukraine. Lately, I took a part in a Professor Ching-Chang Cheng lecture at the Jagiellonian University, and he said that if Russia had been able to conquer Ukraine, the China would have do similar approach, for example, use a military force. However, Russia failed. United States strongly supported Ukraine, and the China became more cautious in this aspect. However, what about the future scenarios? As I said, it's a very difficult question because it will be very difficult to maintain status quo. But it is possible to imagine that despite all this saber-rattling and muscle flexing, People's Republic of China will come to the conclusion that at this very moment, challenging United States and using any military tools would be very risky, especially that the war at Ukraine really proved that Western military technologies are better than ex-Soviet and post-Russian ones, especially that despite all the modernization programs, China military still relies mostly on post-Soviet technologies, and it needs some time to change all this equipment and improve the Chinese military capabilities. So this is the first scenario, but in my opinion, it will be very difficult. Erosion of the order is, my opinion, more probable, especially that in this situation, there are not only factors like economy, military power, but also factors like patriotism or nationalism. For example, in China, there is the authorities put a lot of interest on patriotic education and the slogan never return of national humiliation, that China was humiliated over 100 years by the colonial powers and Japan, and this time has ended. So nowadays, China, using this rhetoric, can just turn back because it could be a humiliation, in fact. So they are these factors like nationalism, chauvinism, which may lead to the irrational steps. However, this is a question which is very difficult to answer. Military option, military confrontation, it's difficult to predict. In my opinion, the risk of any military confrontation is very low at this moment against Taiwan, because China had taken into consideration that any amphibious assault on Taiwan would be a very risky operation and may fail easily. So it would have significant, not only military consequences, but also political. Imagine the Chinese leader imagine all the Chinese leaders who made this decision of using a military against Taiwan and the operation failed. It would be probably the Chinese leader, there will be a kind of discussion what happened and who's guilty. Who's guilty? So it could lead to the situation that the leaders will be fight for power in China, and the leaders could be changed by the, let's say, opposition, or the people who contested this steps, and tried to say that China should play more swiftly with the United States using, for example, economy, not military. However, there is a risk that an accident may happen. Human wrong and incident may lead a military collapse. There is also a risk set. So we may see the scenarios of maintaining status quo, erosion of the order, and military option, but it's very difficult which one will be the most probable. In my opinion, the erosion of the whole order is the most probable because, as it was mentioned, China is a revisionist power. China would like to change the status quo in the region of Western Pacific, and United States will not cancel this strategic position, especially that states count on Japan, Australia, Great Britain, and also Southeast Asian countries like Filipino, and also China, and also United States start to have relatively good relations with Vietnam. But as I said, prediction, the drawing a future scenario would be very difficult at this moment because the situation is very complicated, very dynamic, and we observe many interdependencies in the whole environment.
Well, thank you. Any further comments on that, maybe Joel?
Okay, thanks. I actually agree quite a lot in with Łukasz' intervention. In fact, I agree almost everything. The difficult part of future prediction is, of course, that there will be uncertainties, new events that come in that we had not accounted for. The pandemic, of course, the Russian invasion, full-scale invasion, things like that, which exacerbate existing trends. So what I did in my presentation earlier was to try to bring it back to the existing trends, and of course, imagine how discuss how the pandemic and the Russian invasion had made those things worse. So let's say existing trends, and let's say a hypothetical Taiwan scenario where military force is used, right? Now, I don't think it's very likely because China doesn't just have to win; it has to win very, very quickly, which was what Russia's goal was as well, right? And any kind of prolonged conflict is a ticking time bomb for them, right? They've already got a domestic demographic problem, right? You imagine all their one-child sons going into war where they don't come back. These kind of issues are much more significant and sometimes noticed, and I can't imagine the Chinese parents being willing to play with that game for a very long time. Now, but that said, some sort of military confrontation that doesn't quite, that isn't necessarily a sort of full-scale invasion, but one that destabilizes the region significantly is quite possible. And here ASEAN is in a fix because it's not the same scenario as Ukraine and Russia. In their eyes, most of them are committed to a one China policy. So this can legitimately be viewed as an internal matter, albeit with very, very unique circumstances. And so there will not be, or I do not think it will be easy for ASEAN to come up with a common position, for example. Even in the Russia case, we've already had so much difficulty coming up with a common position, even when it's very clear what principles of order have been disrupted. And ASEAN's own principle of treaty amity and cooperation and the peaceful resolution of disputes. That said, the other actors in the region will move ahead of ASEAN, right? Japan, South Korea, potentially even India may be involved because this is their neighborhood too. And this stability of the South China Sea is dependent on this. And so much trade passes right out off the shores of Taiwan that any real conflict there is going to significantly affect this. And so I think the small states will be divided, but the large states will take over. And this is not necessarily a good thing from the small states' perspective, as in you will be rendered irrelevant and unable to act. Now, on the other hand, the continuing erosion of the multilateral order, and I agree with Łukasz that this continues to be the most likely trend. If you look back at the last 5 years, everyone has been warning about this problem, and yet there's no point in which we can say something has improved or something has been done that starts to address the problem. In fact, everything simply seems to be getting worse. And this is the real problem that we don't yet have a solution for, right? the UN Security Council needs reform, the things I mentioned already earlier, and none of them are happening. So what is, in my opinion, then the regions or what has been the trend has been to move towards sort of smaller groupings, right? Sometimes regionally, but also these so-called minilaterals. And minilaterals are specific vehicles for solving transnational problems, but they're not. There's no unifying principle around them, right? So you can have minilaterals that are exclusive and directed towards containment, such as the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US Pact, right? It's designed to provide security technology, share the security technology with Australia. It's not yet quite going to necessarily directly confront China, but there's that latent potential there. Then you have the Quad, which initially started off as a security project, but I think owing to the very different nature of countries, members like India and Japan, has moved more into an economic dimension. And I think this is a much more positive trend among minilateral groupings, right? The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework provides a number of new ways out of sort of traditional binds, although it is, yes, a US vehicle at the moment, and one that China will view very negatively. But basically the point is that sort of smaller groupings of like-minded states can still move forward, or I hope they can still move forward and find ways to cooperate among these things, among shared interests that everyone agrees are problems: climate change, sort of energy transition, and pandemic preparedness, and even just simple economic recovery are still significant problems that we do have common interests around. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dominika, would you like to add something?
It's quite impressive what my colleagues just said. So I don't really have that much to add, to supplement. They really covered everything. If there is anything I would like to add, is that it's very interesting to hear it in the context of 2023 Asia Power Index, that mostly focus on China's isolation, but also the fact how the US remains on top of sort of Asian power, but only because of China's setbacks, as well as the fact that the whole region of Southeast Asia is more diplomatically dynamic than ever, which is in particular interesting in the context of what ASEAN is doing. But that's about it. Like, this was very comprehensive coverage of the whole issue.
Thank you so much. We're privileged to have Professor Bayer with us, who can conclude from his long-term perspective and very wide experience. Professor, please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. Professor, we're not hearing you.
Do you hear me now? Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, but you should unmute yourself only on one device. If you're unmuted on both, you will have an echo. So please unmute yourself only on one device and turn the loudspeakers on the others.
So is it better now?
A bit better, but also if you have a sound on and one, you should turn it off as well.
How about now?
It's still echoing, so please maybe turn on the noise, the sound, the audio from the other device.
I've got 0 as far as voice is concerned.
Okay, could you maybe leave from one of your accounts, because we're going to have an echo from.
I have always found, the IT to be a dreadful thing, and that's why I hardly ever use it.
Now we can hear you perfectly. Please go on. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you.
And how about now? Do you read me, but you don't see me, right?
But it's okay. It's your, let's say, audio input, which is crucial.
That's right. You know, I've been trying to work on two computers at the same time because one of them doesn't want to show me. It hates me so much that it doesn't show me. You know, so but nevertheless, I found your exchange of views to be extremely interesting because I don't know whether it's been done by yourself or is it a sort of coordination, but you have been covering specific groups of topics, each of you. So you give a complete picture if you act together. So I think one aspect has to be added, you know, to all those presentations, and namely the foreign policy and internal affairs of China and the United States, because everything may be someday dependent on what happens in Beijing and what happens in Washington. In Washington, we are going to have the next presidential election late next year. And dependent on that, we'll see what stance the United States takes in Asia in general, and in Southeast Asia and East Asia in particular. If we get Mr. Trump on top of the power pyramid, then things may be worse for international affairs, but not necessarily in East Asia, for the relations in the Pacific, because this is a specific problem for the United States. Its continuous presence since the Second World War, it's number one. Chinese threat to this position is number two. And number three, as a conclusion to it, is that the United States is not able to allow China to get any more gains in the western part of the Pacific, or let's say even in the central part of the Pacific Ocean altogether. And that's why I would not see Mr. Trump's possible or presumable victory in the election race to be a disaster for the Pacific. And that means, in turn, that regardless of the results of the presidential election in the United States, we may have to do with a strong or even stronger American presence in the western part of the Pacific. And here, I do agree with what Mr. Ng has said, that there will be a sort of split in positions of ASEAN member states, and some of them will, in fact, ally with the US because they will feel the American support to their position in confrontation with China, which is inevitably coming. Now, if we come to China, then I think we are entering, or we started to enter, the very crucial period. It's between 2022 and 2027. In 27, we'll have the 21st National Congress of the Communist Party of China. And this is also going to be the third unprecedented consecutive for Mr. Xi Jinping in power as a sort of, I dare say, a dictator, because the position he has been occupying right now has not resulted for any sort of election, as for the recent session of the Chinese parliament and also the previous party congress in October 22. He has been simply approved by all the members of those two bodies, which is a typical communist tradition, as it was at the time of Joseph Stalin, as it was under Nikita Khrushchev, as it was under Leonid Brezhnev, and so on and so on. And also Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin as well. So Mr. Xi Jinping has got this period of less than 5 years right now to deliver on what he has promised. And we must bear in mind, that the Chinese party and the Chinese state have become, by their own definition and by their own promise, hostages to their political agenda, because they promised to their nation and got a sort of legitimization from that. One will be, in inverted commas, reunified with the motherland. And it must be done by the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic, which means 2049. And Xi Jinping needs a success. Some things have failed, mostly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. So he badly needs a great success. And this must be done by the next National Congress of the party in 2027. Otherwise, he might expect a sort of opposition, not only from the political establishment in China, but also in form of, let's say, people's dissatisfaction. I think you remember, the situation from November last year and early December, when people became, completely fed up with the COVID restrictions and took to the streets and expressed their voices. And then it was already after the party congress, and Mr. Xi was assured in his position that he had to give up as far as restrictions were concerned, and the party declared the pandemics to be non-existent anymore. Again, a typical communist solution. The party adopts a resolution that, let's say, a disease had disappeared overnight. And this is the case. So the next success should be Taiwan. There are many promises. There have been a number of military actions to intimidate Taiwan and also to show a sort of danger and threat to the Western world, to avoid any entanglement by the Western countries into the Taiwanese trade situation. So I think we are just entering the very crucial period right now. So I think your analysis, concerning the erosion of the international order in the area is very correct. And the split among all the countries on the ground are also very correct. Combined with all those, let's say, dangerous phenomena like cybersecurity, and maybe in particular, the faked information and disinformation, which is China's and Russia's specialty. So I think that deserves very special attention from democratic societies and governments. As a former UN military, I dare express, my critical view of the United Nations. I fully agree with Dr. Ng's analysis, saying that we are facing a sort of crisis as far as reform of the international order is concerned. On one hand, we have China, which is striving very much to change that order in its favor. We can understand it, China is on the ascent, and what China sees as something natural is the restoration of the classical order, classical state of affairs, that China was a local superpower as the empire. And it's very correct what Mr. Stark said, concerning 百年国耻. 100 years of the national humiliation. China would like to erase, to delete this picture, but it's not so easy. So China wants to restore its position, and China will do everything it can to do that. This is the flip side. On the flop side, on the other hand, we have the Western world, which has not been able to reform the United Nations. When I stayed in the UN troops in Somalia, in Cambodia, in Yemen, in Rwanda during the carnage, in many other areas, also in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in other parts of the world, I came to a very nasty conclusion that the abbreviation UN, which stands for the United Nations, may as well stand for useless nonsense. If we regard things like overgrown bureaucracy, for example, lack of rapid reaction, then many attempts to hush up the facts. The case of Rwanda, the UN head office, headquarters in New York, got reports about the upcoming carnage at least 3 months ahead of time. And all of them landed in deep drawers in UN offices in New York. No reaction whatsoever was attempted. And until the civil war in Rwanda started. So I think it may happen in each and every next case as well. That's why I don't see any role for the United Nations in international affairs at its present shape right now. So for the time being, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'm opening floor to the questions, also additional comments. Please write them in the chat. Also, we have some time left, so you can either raise a hand.
May I just have a few comments to Ambassador Bayer's profound remarks. I think you're very right. The US and China domestic situations are very important for understanding if or how things may change, and they will affect all of us in the whole wide world. And now Donald Trump's potential return is a bit of a conundrum, because on the one hand, I think Trump was correct to do, firstly, to reset the tone with China. After Obama's attempts at accommodation, I think he was correct that this was not going to happen, especially not under Xi Jinping. And secondly, to also require greater commitment from its allies in the region. Right, he applied equal pressure to NATO as well as to Korea and Japan to raise their security expenditures for their own support, and this was the correct thing. At the same time, Trump was also very bad at alliance building. So unfortunately, he for probably personality reasons, he alienated all of his original Security Council staff, the likes of James Mattis and so forth. And then he replaced them with much more inferior candidates who were not good at understanding the dynamics of the region and therefore building strong alliances that the region needed. And so if he comes back, I think the same paradox is going to return, which means that the countries in the region will have this sort of commitment question. How much is the US actually committed, and how well can it follow through with its implementation if it does? So I'm not sure. I mean, Biden has his own problems, but I think he's much better at playing the international game. Now, in China, there was a bit of a paradox as well, that Xi Jinping is extremely ambitious. At the same time, he's just got what he wanted, which was that third term, and age is against him. I don't think a fourth term is very likely. Maybe, but I think it will be much more difficult for him to achieve given the Communist Party dynamics. And he has to start seriously thinking about succession. And for his successor to be able to thrive, he will need actually a stable international environment. He can't throw his successor basically into the deep end of the swimming pool. And this was the thing that Deng Xiaoping knew or understood very clearly, and which led to the rapprochement with the US, which was that when he took over, the international environment was extremely unstable, and he could not carry out the reforms China needed in order to change it, reorient itself from that very disastrous cultural revolution that it had gone through. And so there was actually an opportunity for peace. I hope to keep a silver lining on it, that somehow they can manage to find ways to motivate these potential leaders to continue to look for ways of peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this valuable comment. Are there any more comments and questions from the audience?
May I?
Mm-hmm.
There is this sentence, may you live in interesting times. And we are living in interesting times. And for Southeast Asian smaller countries, the times are not interesting, but uncertain. And in my opinion, they may have a problem to find itself in these times and secure its core national interest. And I have a question to Dr. Yoel from Singapore, because Singapore, as one of the Indonesian leaders said, it's a little red dot. And despite the size, small size and small population, Singapore has a astonishing military power, as well as a very developed economy. however, is highly dependent on international trade and supply chains, and especially maritime traffic. And could you inform us about the Singapore policy toward both China and US? Because I'm especially interested, especially in the context in war on Ukraine, how Singapore tried to deal all this issue. As I said, its military and economic potential is significant. However, it's highly dependent on the trade and maritime traffic, and how to Singapore try to deal with this great powers rivalry, especially in the context of a war on Ukraine. Thank you for the answer.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very difficult question. Now we are very economically close to China and the US equally. And that's not going to change anytime soon, or if it does, it will be disastrous for Singapore, right? We cannot disrupt that huge amount of economic relationships with both states. At the same time, I think Singapore has been pretty clear about its need to stand up for principles that enable its functioning as an independent state, right? The history of city-states is one of fragility, right? Most city-states in the world have vanished. Right, you think about all the ones Europe had until about the 15th to 17th centuries, when they started disappearing one after another. And so Singapore is well aware of that. Our birth as a nation is also an accident of history. And so we need that international order to survive. And if we don't have it, we will quickly be eaten up. Now, why or how might it be possible to survive under those circumstances? We need to keep China and the US talking to each other. We also need them to understand or to try to interpret each other's actions a little bit more charitably than they have done, right? So both consider each other the greatest threat to world peace, right? Now, it's possible both are correct, but it's not only themselves that will have to enact such a conflict. It would have to be both of them acting in such a way that no resolution is possible. And so what our leaders have been consistently trying to say is that China and the US really need to talk to each other, try to get a better understanding of each other. And of course, as Ambassador Barry said, for domestic reasons, this is very, very difficult, right? It's impossible, given the domestic conditions in both states, for the people to understand why there is a need to talk to the adversary. And there are still yet a number of common interests that we hope. One of actually the most recent one that gives me a little bit of hope is Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons. And this, I think, is a red line issue for China. I think that genuinely they would not be able to stand for that. And China is trying to behave like a global actor, play a statesman role in crises. Like they recently concluded a restoration of diplomatic ties between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, which is showing that they do have a constructive role to play. They've also, or Singapore and ASEAN states have been also urging them to conclude this code of conduct talks on the South China Sea issue, which is very important to Southeast Asia. So if they want to be recognized at the new global table, then they have to act that way. For the United States, I mean, they're the established power. We actually know what it's like to live under their sort of order, and it's generally a good one, a good experience. And so the main thing is to try to resolve the domestic problems that they have. If right now there are some very, very serious domestic issues in the US that need to be resolved, and it's also driving this kind of very strong pendulum swings between left and right in terms of how they address these things. And the main thing is for the US that needs to get its house in order, right? If the government or the political system as a whole actually can restore some confidence from its different political wings in their ability to govern, then that will hopefully be the source of resolving tensions at the international level as well.
Oh, thank you so much. That's the last chance for additional questions and comments, but I don't see them in the chat. Therefore, I would like again to express my gratitude for sharing your knowledge, which is quite unique, especially in the Central European context. Thanks a lot, and we're about to finish.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, many thanks.